Hey everyone, today I wanted to talk about Petrified Blood and why it is an utterly terrible defensive mechanic. I've seen a lot of people recommend this in guides recently as a way of making a character more tanky and defensive, and I've had a number of people ask me whether for early hit or Stormbrand, whether they can just fit Petrified Blood into the build as a way of making it tankier because they feel that those builds aren't tanky enough. And I'm constantly telling people not to do so, but I decided I'd make a video to sort of show you why exactly, using some hard numbers and evidence. And so I'll just give you a quick run through of the numbers. So this graph basically, it's discounting all of your character's leech and regen, and it's just showing you like the increase in damage taken overall. So if you were to start with 10,000 HP and you were to receive a hit of 10,000 damage, you'd be left on about 1 HP, so you'd survive that hit, right? On the other hand, if you had Petrified Blood 2020, your new HP would be 5,000, your incoming damage would be 6,000, and then the dot damage that you take after would be about 3,000, for an overall increase of 80% damage taken. If we factor in anomalous Petrified Blood 2020, your incoming damage is now 5,500, which is a little lower, but the dot damage is more than doubled to 6,345. So it's an overall increase of 137% damage taken, right? Which is insane. And this is represented in the graph here, where you can see this is 100% sort of damage taken here, no Petrified Blood. Petrified Blood 2020 brings it up to about, 1.8? But anomalous Petrified Blood causes you to take more than double the damage, farm almost 2.5 times as much damage running anomalous Petrified Blood. Now, on the right hand side, we have basically the incoming damage if your character had insane amounts of regen or leech, right? So we're going to pretend that the dot damage is 0 because you're just out regening or out leeching it all. Now, with normal Petrified Blood, the increase in damage taken is about 20%, and with anomalous Petrified Blood, it's 10%, right? So even if you had insane amounts of regen and leech, your character is still taking overall more damage than if you had simply not run Petrified Blood, right? And there are costs associated with running Petrified Blood. Now, a lot of people act as though if you simply have enough regen or life, then the dot damage doesn't matter. But the reality is that by consuming all your leech or your regen to mitigate this new incoming dot damage, there's a lot of other forms of degen that you can no longer survive in a lot of cases, right? So if you were to take a large hit while standing on caustic ground, for example, that would pretty much kill your character almost guaranteed. And something a lot of people forget about Petrified Blood, both anomalous and normal, is that degen is not in any way mitigated. So you're giving up half your life, but it's not mitigating degen. So any kind of caustic ground, any kind of damage over time effect on your character is pretty much doubled in effectiveness. So when you're normally running about 5,000 life and you cut that down to 2,500, pretty much any form of degen your character takes is almost a guaranteed death, right? So even in the scenario where you have enough regen or leech to not really worry about the increase in damage taken, it's still such a large penalty to your character's survivability that it makes it very hard to justify. Now, why would you run Petrified Blood? I guess a lot of you are wondering. Well, it's an offensive layer. That's what it is. Petrified Blood is used more or less to enable low life offensive bonuses to your character. So I would probably say that in the case of attack-based characters, there aren't too many tools that really warrant running Petrified Blood, with probably the single exception of a champion that is using Adrenaline. You can utilize Petrified Blood in a way that you can pretty much have permanent uptime on Adrenaline, which is incredibly useful, and perhaps, probably in my opinion, the only real valid use for Petrified Blood on an attack-based champion. For a spell-based champion, however, it's pretty much just to take Pain Attunement, which is 30% more damage. Now, I would make the argument that if your character had enough regen to basically not worry about the dot damage here, so you thought that there was like some worthwhile trade-off where your character's taking 20 or 10% more damage in return for doing 30% more damage, here's the thing. If you had that much regen on your character, you might just be able to sustain Righteous Fire permanently, and Righteous Fire is going to provide a larger buff to your spell damage in most cases than Petrified Blood would. So I have a hard time really justifying running Petrified Blood at all, especially considering that, again, you're lowering your max HP and basically making yourself take twice as much damage from all forms of degen in the game. So I'm really just not convinced that this is a good offensive layer either. I think the use of it on champions to sustain adrenaline is really, really good and very valid, but I've personally tested this on a number of spell-based characters, so Stormbrand, Winter Orb, a number of others that I've played this league, and I overall just feel like the trade-off isn't worth it, and that with its current numbers and tuning, it's very, very overrated and just not worth running. Now, something we haven't talked about yet is that it requires a reservation of 35% mana. Now, this isn't free. How does this really translate? What does this translate to in terms of what your character has to give up to run it? Well, this is if you're reserving your actual mana here, then it's costing you, say, a discipline or maybe a flesh and stone, right? You're giving up some kind of other 35% reservation, which could be used as an actual defensive layer to your character. In the case of Flesh and Stone, you're applying blind to enemies. That's a 50% overall mitigation for melee damage. Physical damage, right? And in the case of Discipline, that's a lot of base energy shield. So for a character that is int-based and scaling Corrupted Soul, so like pretty much a lot of Witch builds, a lot of Templar builds, a lot of Shadow builds, you're giving up a lot of energy shield in return for running this, right? So it has that added cost, and then in return, you get to reserve for half your life. That's only allowing you to add a Herald in to your build, right? Because a Herald with Arrogance support is approximately 50% mana reservation when you're reserving life. So you are adding damage to your character, but the amount of damage that you're gaining in return for what you're giving up, in my opinion, just isn't worth it. It still may be valid, and it still may be a trade-off that you personally want to make, especially if you're trying to just push your DPS and you're happy to play a glass cannon, you don't care about the amount of incoming damage your character's taking. That's fine, right? I'm not gonna tell people the way they should play the particular mix of damage and defense that they should feel comfortable with, because obviously that's different on a per player basis, and it really has to do with how comfortable you are as an individual, you know, interacting with certain mechanics and what sort of content your character's doing. But as a defensive layer, there is no scenario whatsoever where Petrified Blood is actually making your character tankier. In every scenario, for hit-based damage, it is making your character squishier, and for degen, it is pretty much turning degen into a fatal source of damage in a lot of scenarios, right? So I would just never, ever recommend running Petrified Blood if you are having problems keeping your character alive. It doesn't really work. You're giving up too much for it. You're taking far too much increased damage. Okay, so that's pretty much my video. I hope that sort of cleared things up for a lot of people. And yeah, I'll see you guys in the next one.